Can you believe it was 2019 when the Necromancer was released? This marks the longest stretch we've gone in ESO without a new class being added. We had the Warden in 2017, the Necromancer in 2019, and now in 2023 we have the Arcanist. Well, after quite a bit of time with it on an early preview build as well as on the public test server, I can say that I do think it was worth the wait. The Arcanist is really fun to play, and it seems like ZOS took their time with it and made sure that it was not only unique in the visual and audio effects, which are really good by the way. Check this out. But the Arcanist also has a very unique playstyle. The main flow of combat for the class just feels a lot different from anything we've had previously. And while the playstyle isn't anything too complicated, there are quite a few things you'll want to know in order to get the most out of your character. So for this video, I'll be walking you through how to set up your Arcanist as a damage dealer. We'll cover the main aspects of the build, all the way from setting up the attributes to the finer details of the combat rotations, and close it out with some clips in action on the trial dummy. But first, let me start off by giving a huge thanks to Rai. He was a really big help with testing and contributed the 128k parse that I'll be showing later in the video. Really great player, and he has a lot of DPS guides for ESO up on his YouTube as well. So make sure to check him out for some more ESO build ideas. So in this guide here, I'll be covering the setup that he used, plus a slightly tweaked setup that got me 125k DPS using one less skill to make room for a utility slot and slightly different gear. I'll cover a 1-bar setup that got me to 100k DPS with a super easy rotation, and I think a lot of you are going to like this setup a lot. And then I also have what I'm calling the 1.5 bar build. This is another really easy rotation, and as you can see, it can still get some really nice results. So starting off with the attributes, as an Arcanist, it is perfectly viable to go all 64 points into Magicka or all into Stamina. The Arcanist has many skills in their kit that have dynamic cost scaling to automatically choose your highest or lowest attribute to pull from for that skill cost. And so because of this, it's very easy to build either route, and it's ultimately up to you. My personal preference, at least for the launch of the Arcanist, is to stack into Stamina. I feel like my overall sustain is a bit easier to manage going this route, and I generally just prefer Stamina setups in ESO. If you want to go Magicka, by all means, you can definitely do that. It doesn't really matter one way or the other, but depending on the race that you choose for your Arcanist, this may help you decide which route you want to go. Now, any race can compete as a damage dealer for any class in the Elder Scrolls Online. And really, if you aren't doing some of the hardest achievements in the game or score pushing, this choice really doesn't matter too much. However, from a pure DPS perspective, there are certain races that do have a statistical advantage over others. If you are going the Magicka route, High Elves and Dark Elves are tied for that top spot. And then for most gameplay, Khajiits are also tied with them. However, since their main damage in their racial passive comes from the 12% crit damage that they have, and crit damage is capped in the Elder Scrolls Online, for highly optimized groups, Khajiits end up a little bit behind those other options. Now, there is plenty of reason to go with other races as well. Bretons, for example, have very nice damage and also excellent sustain passives, and even your worst statistical options are still going to be within about 5% or so for damage, and they still have other passives that you can benefit from as a Magicka damage dealer. For example, if you wanted to go as an Imperial here, you do have 2,000 health and 6% cost reduction to all of your abilities. And then on the Stamina side of things, Dark Elf is the best option again here for pure damage. Same thing goes with Khajiit again. They're pretty much tied if you're fully benefiting from that crit damage passive that they have, but they fall down the list a bit if you're not. Orc is also very close behind. I know for me personally, when I'm actually doing content, I can't tell the difference in my damage levels if I'm playing Dark Elf or an Orc, and Orc has some nice passives as well, like the extra health and sprint speed. Ultimately, you can use these charts I showed as a reference, but as I opened up with, it really doesn't make a huge difference unless you're getting into some of the most difficult content, but if you are, it may be worth it to squeeze out every little bit that you can. For the Mundus Stone, we'll be going with the Thief. This is a nice bonus to our crit chance, nearly 10% when we have the Divine's trait on our gear. For our food, I've been preferring the max resource plus max health food for the majority of content that I've been doing. So depending on if you're going to Magicka or Stamina, you'll prefer one of these or the other. For the dummy parses, we are using the green single stat food though. For more difficult content, you probably want to sacrifice the extra 1k resource you get on these for the max health with the buy stat. But all of that said, there are a lot of other good options to go with if you need more sustain or more of your off resource. I won't go super detailed here into all of these, but I do have all of them on my website under the build page at skinnycheeks.gg. For our potions, all of the setups I'm going to show have our major buffs taken care of. So generally the tri-stat potions are going to be a really nice option here. And this would include the daily login reward versions of these. These are the same as the ones that you can craft. And then if you do have the gold to afford the more expensive heroism potions, these are going to squeak out the highest DPS. They are super expensive though, just a warning. For our champion points, the main 2 slottable nodes in the warfare tree will be Biting Aura and Thaumaturge. These 2 will pretty much always be slotted no matter the scenario. You're typically going to get like 70 to 80% of your damage boosted by these, and at that range you pretty much never want to take these off. That makes setups for the Arcanist a little bit easier, as for bosses or trash or whatever, you don't really have to change things up much. Now for the 3rd and the 4th nodes, I'll go through a few different possible scenarios. For practicing on the trial dummy, you'll want to go with Wrathful Strikes and Exploiter. This is due to our crit damage and penetration being capped out already, and the trial dummy has perfect off-balance uptime for Exploiter at 31.8% uptime. Averaged out, that comes out to about a 3.2% damage boost overall from the Exploiter champion point node, but this can be worth a little more if your ultimates end up lining up well, and you'll see that Rye does that in his 128k parse. But even if you aren't paying too close attention to this, because of how little single target and direct damage we have, Deadly Aim and Master Arms are pretty much never going to be worth slotting. Now for most of us, the trial dummy is a set of conditions that our groups won't be coordinated enough to have, so if you are needing a good bit more crit damage, I'd swap in Backstabber and Fighting Finesse in those 3rd and 4th nodes. Or if you don't need that full 18%, but you do need some more crit damage, you can just run Fighting Finesse and then keep Wrathful Strikes in there as your 3rd and 4th nodes. Force of Nature could also come into play as well, however the Arcanist already gets a lot of penetration in their kit, so typically you should be covered there. All right, next up, we'll go through the gear setups. As always, there are a lot of combos that you can run and get really great results. I won't dive too deep into what all of these sets do. I did just make a video covering all my favorite sets going into update 38, so make sure to check that one out if you are looking for more info on that. But these setups coming up are just some of my favorites for the Arcanist. One thing that is key to know up front is that because of the Arcanist's long beam channel, we'll get into that more later, but there are a lot of sets that would normally be great options on other classes that cannot be effectively used on the Arcanist. Sets such as Reliquin that rely on consistent light attack weaving, well, you can't do light attacks while you're beaming, so any set with a condition like this is pretty much off the table. And I also removed Sororia from my list. While you could technically still use it, I found it to be really frustrating to try and keep up, because if the circle disappears right as you start beaming, well, you're just out of luck and the Sororia stacks are going to drop off. So I just avoid all sets that have trigger conditions like this. There are plenty of other good options that don't come with the headache. All right, first up, this is the combo that Rye used in his 128k parse. So we have 1-piece Slime Craw, 5-piece Coral Riptide, 5-piece Pillar of Nirn, and the Maelstrom Inferno Staff on the back bar. This is a very strong combo if you can work with that Coral Riptide bonus and keep your stamina low. It's actually fairly easy to do on the trial dummy, but in a real raid environment, this could be a lot more difficult, and it's always a bit risky to run low on stamina since you need that resource to block and roll dodge. One thing I really like to do is swap out Pillar of Nirn for Deadly Strike. I got 125k with this setup, and with this loadout, the single target results will be very similar while the AoE damage will be much higher. I actually prefer Deadly to Pillar for most encounters. The 15% boost just synergizes so well with the Arcanist beam. Now, if you don't want to play the Coral Riptide minigame, that's me, I don't want to play that game, you can also run the Oakensoul's Torment set, and this is another really good option. It doesn't have quite the same top end as Coral does, but it is just a flat 7% bonus that you don't have to worry about. It's just there at all times. I've seen this combo being used on Arcanists in the new trial, and it's getting really good results. Since both sets are just percent boosts, this is going to give you a ton of AoE damage while still keeping your single target damage really good too. This will probably be the setup that I use the most often of the 3 combos that I just showed. But just know that Coral Riptide does have the higher upside if you want to sweat that out a bit, and if you are going for the highest possible damage on the dummy. You could also do Deadly or Pillar with Whorl of the Depths. These are really nice combos as well. Since Whorl is a light set, you could just either run the 1 light piece on your waist, or you could swap out the jewels with Deadly to get a few more light pieces if you find yourself needing more penetration. If you are running Deadly here, it's pretty nice because it does boost the proc from Whorl of the Depths. The main drawback here, as always with Whorl, is that it is a stationary AoE, so it can miss the target sometimes in mobile fights. And then for the Arcanist in particular, another drawback is that since it procs on light attack damage, sometimes it will be ready to go just after you start channeling your beam, and therefore you end up losing a little uptime on it. But even with the lost uptime, it is still a pretty nice option to go with. Zul'Xan's Torment is another great set that you could pair with Deadly Strike if the encounter has enemies dying at least every 30 seconds that you can pick up the souls from. This will just be a flat 10% crit chance and 12% crit damage boost, which is pretty amazing if you can keep it up. Definitely a popular option for AoE trash encounters. And then there are plenty of other good 5-piece sets that you can go with as well for this. I'll have the gear tier list listed under the build page on the website at skinnycheeks.gg. For our monster set, it's usually a 1-piece slime crawl, but a 1-piece with penetration can be nice if you aren't already capped out. And then for our back bar set, I really like the Maelstrom Arena Staff. It's currently my favorite option. It adds great AoE damage to the blockade of fire, and it synergizes really well with the AoE heavy kit of the Arcanist. I think this is the one that I'll be using the most. But there are some really good alternatives as well, such as the Black Rose Prison Daggers, the Master's Bow, the Maelstrom's Bow, and the Maelstrom's Two-Handed Sword. So if you prefer a little different playstyle, these are definitely all viable options. And then finally for the Mythic, we're going with the Velothi Mage's Amulet. This works really well on the Arcanist, as the penalty of losing our light attack damage is not as severe on the Arcanist as it is on other classes, since you already miss out on your light attacks while you're beaming. So the flat 15% boost to all of our damage is really noticeable, but the light attack loss is not too bad. The extra penetration and the minor force are nothing too crazy there, but can be nice to help with a bit of flexibility in setting up our builds. And then finally for the gear traits, as always, all divines on the body pieces, bloodthirsty on the jewelry, infused on the back bar, and Nirnhoned on the main hand of the front bar. For the offhand trait on the front bar, I do have charged or precise listed there. I like charged slightly more for single target damage, especially combined with deadly strike, since that's going to be boosting all of our status effect dots too. But precise is really great for AoE damage. If you are doing double dual wield, you can do flame and weapon damage on the back bar, and poison plus really any damaging glyph on the front bar. Charged might be the best just on the off chance that you add in some minor vulnerability, but it really doesn't matter too much, as you won't be getting much out of this glyph no matter which one it is. Come on Zos, bleed glyph win. But anyways, next up we'll go through some alternate setups. If you don't have any trials gear yet, no worries, you can get some really good results just putting Deadly Strike and Pillar of Nirn together. Pillar is a great set to have on many classes, so might as well pick it up. And Deadly Strike is one that you can grab off of the guild traders with gold, so no farming is necessary for that one. If you haven't farmed Pillar of Nirn yet and you need something in the meantime, Order's Wrath is a great craftable option, and Venomous Smite is also a very nice overland set, really almost even with Pillar of Nirn, and you can grab that one off of the guild traders. For the 1-bar setup, my favorite combo here, and the one that got me to 100k DPS, is going to be Deadly Strike and Pillar of Nirn with the Oakensoul Mythic. Since Oakensoul gives you Minor Slayer, you don't need to worry about having a trial set here, and these two work so well together. If you don't have Pillar yet, again, you can do Venomous Smite and get very similar results with a little bit larger AoE on that one. I really like all three of these sets a lot for the Oakensoul 1-bar setup. And then finally, something a little bit different here, an alternate setup to get a little more tankiness at the cost of a little bit of damage. You can run a 5-piece Deadly Strike with a 3-piece trial set for that Minor Slayer, preferably one with a crit chance on it like Coral Riptide, then Maelstrom Staff on the back bar and Black Rose Prison Dual Wield on the front bar, and you get that 6% damage done and 6% reduced damage taken with the Black Rose Prison Dual Wield. This is a nice and easy setup, and you don't really have to think about any of it. It kind of just does its thing. No specific stacks or procs to worry about. The damage is just there, and you're a little bit tankier than your more traditional setup. So this could be nice if you're trying to play a little bit safer. All right, now I'll go through the skills. One of the nice things about the Arcanist is that you don't really need to switch much up for bosses versus AoE trash situations. Their kit handles both very well with roughly the same setup. So first off, I'll go through the standard 2-bar build. This is what got Rye the 128k parse and what I used for my 125k one as well. Oh, and also shout out to ESOskillbook.com for the tooltips that I'm using here. Really great website to look these up if you need to. Starting off, we have Camo Hunter here for the crit chance passive that it has for just slotting it, and also the weapon and spell damage boost from the Slayer passive in the Fighters Guild line. If you are stacking into Magicka instead of Stamina, and you also have a reliable source of Minor Berserk, such as a healer in your group with Combat Prayer, you can go with Inner Light instead of Camo Hunter for a tiny bit more damage. If you need the Minor Berserk though, or if you're stacking into Stamina, definitely go with Camo Hunter. And then we have Blade Cloak. This is a really nice AoE dot. It adds major evasion, reducing our AoE damage taken by 20%. And then something really nice on the Arcanist, it will keep our flame and poison enchantments procced while we're channeling the Fate Carver beam. Since we can't light attack weave during that 5-second channel, this will be nice to make sure we don't miss out on a ton of that damage from our status effects. For the morphs, Deadly Cloak deals extra damage. This is probably what you'll most commonly see when used on the front bar here, but the other morph, Quick Cloak, also works really well. It has a nice 4-second speed burst when you activate it, and it also lasts 30 seconds instead of 20, so you can spend a small bit more time beaming. Next up is Barbed Trap. This is a really nice single target damage over time ability because it will add in a ton of extra hemorrhaging uptime. We don't really have another source for hemorrhaging in our kit, so this is going to be a must-have for single target damage, and it also gives us the nice 3% weapon and spell damage boost for being a Fighter's Guild skill. Barbed Trap also adds in Minor Force, but since the Velothi mythic is the one that we're using, it's a bit redundant here, so that's not really why we're using this ability, and we can swap it out when a more AoE heavy situation calls for it. Or you could just leave it here for the passive damage boost as well. So must have for single target damage, but flexible if you're focused more on AoE. Next up we have Cephaliarch's Flail. This is a nice strong AoE spammable, very similar to Whirling Blades in the damage it deals and the way that it functions. After 50% health remaining on the enemy, this starts scaling up to 100% more damage based on the missing health. So for example, at 25% health remaining, it is dealing 50% more damage. It also provides a very nice 20-second debuff on the target called Abyssal Ink. This lets you deal 5% more damage to any enemy that you apply this to. Next up, it also has a heal on it. Whenever you cast it, it heals you for about half of the tooltip that you have for the damage portion. This doesn't scale up and execute like the damage part does. It's just a flat heal that scales with your offensive stats. But it doesn't even stop there, as if this skill didn't have enough already. The most important reason we're actually using this is because it generates Crux. So I'm sure most of you already are familiar with the basic idea of the Crux system at this point, so I won't dive super deep into that again, but it is a very important mechanic to engage with if you want to deal the highest damage possible on the Arcanist. And Crux will generate by using this skill as long as you are in combat. So during transition phases in fights, you can cast this to top yourself off on Crux and get ready for the next phase. You just can't pre-buff it outside of combat. So there are a few other reasons to build up Crux that I'll go through in the passives later, but the main reason that we're building it up is so we can dump them with the Fate Carver beam. This is the strongest ability in the game right now, and really where most of your power is going to come from as an Arcanist. Using it without Crux is not very good. However, the beam increases in damage by 33% per Crux spent, so you really want to get 3 stacks every time you use this to get that double damage from your beam. As we've discussed a good bit already in this video, the beam does lock you into that channel for 4 to 5 seconds depending on your morph, and during that time you will not be able to take any other actions other than moving and aiming. You can't light attack weave, you can't block or roll dodge without canceling the beam. So definitely important to get in the right position before you start this. As for which morph to take, both morphs of this skill are very good. For pure damage, the Exhausting morph is going to be a little bit better, as that extends the time of the beam by 1 second, which comes out to 3 additional ticks of damage every time we cast it. And then the Pragmatic Fate Carver morph gives a nice damage shield, a really nice damage shield, and it scales up with your offensive stats. So this will be really nice for solo play, and also if you want to play a little safer for group content as well. And then finally for our front bar, we have the Flawless Dawnbreaker Ultimate. This is mostly just here for the Fighter's Guild passive that we already discussed, but you can use it in a pinch if you know you won't have enough time left in the fight to build up for our main ultimate, which we'll cover in just a minute. For our back bar, we have Camo Hunter here again. This is a flex spot if you need a utility skill. I'll cover a few options for that here in a bit. It is nice to have the crit chance buff here on the back bar, but since we spend way less time on the back bar, it is something we can replace if we really need to. Next up is Blockade of Fire. I really like this morph as it lasts 15 seconds, and so we have more time spent on our front bar to deal more damage with our beam. Really strong AoE skill, and it keeps up our weapon damage enchantment, so this is definitely a must-have. If you're not running a Flame Staff on the back bar, this is where you'll put the respective ability from that weapon line that also keeps up your weapon damage enchantment. So for a two-hander, this is Stampede, really strong dot, and a nice tool for moving around quickly too. Just not quite as big of an AoE as Blockade of Fire. If you're using using a bow, this will be Endless Hail. I prefer the longer morph here again, just so we have more time beaming on the front bar. And then finally for dual wield, you'll have Blade Cloak. Both the Deadly Cloak and the Quick Cloak morphs are very nice here. Deadly Cloak does slightly more DPS, but Quick Cloak lasts longer, leaving you more time on your front bar, and also gives a speed burst for 4 seconds whenever you initially activate it. Next up, we have Fulminating Rune. This ability is a little bit different. Initially, you apply it to a single target, but then it spreads to nearby enemies. So in practice, it functions more like an AoE dot, though it is classified as a single target one that goes on multiple enemies. After 6 seconds though, we get another burst of damage from this. It isn't a lot, not enough to be worth recasting this every 6 seconds, but it is nice to have a little bit extra there nonetheless. And then the strongest part of this ability actually is that it provides a damage synergy for your teammates, but not just for one person. Up to 3 people can hit the synergy. So the additional damage coming from casting the skill is actually really high in group play, even though it may look pretty ordinary for just you. So you definitely want to have this one going. Those synergies will add a ton of DPS for the group. The other morph, Rune of Displacement, is also interesting. It seems a bit better suited for support, but there also could be some occasions where you'd want to use that pull-in function. You lose a bit of damage as this doesn't have that 6-second burst, and it only offers 1 synergy for your teammates instead of 3. But it might be worth it for you or a group mate to have this for certain scenarios where you want to pull a bunch of targets in. Next up, we have Tome Bearer's Inspiration. This is such a good skill. We'll typically be going with the Inspired Scholarship morph, as this one will deal a little bit more damage, and we generally don't need the sustain from the other morph. But maybe that is something to consider if you are really struggling with sustain. So first off, it passively gives you major sorcery and brutality by just having it slotted, and it is the first skill in the game to do this for both bars, even if you only have it slotted on one. So I'm really hoping that this opens the doors for other skills in the game to behave similarly down the road. Then this is a nice long 30-second buff that causes your class abilities to deal an additional hit of damage, and that can happen once every 3 seconds. So for a 30-second skill, the DPS on this is actually pretty good. It isn't anything that's going to blow you away, but only having to cast it twice a minute, I think the DPS that it does provide, it's pretty good compared to a lot of the other really long duration skills in the game. But if that's all it did, it would be kind of one of those you can take it or leave it skills, but this next function is what makes it a really crucial skill to run, and that is the passive crux generation. When you proc the damage from this, it will generate a crux if you currently don't have any. So what this means is that when you use your beam, you consume all of your crux, but as long as this skill is going, then the ticks from the beam will interact with this and generate a free crux for you. This is so good because it means that you only need to cast your flail twice to build back to 3 stacks, and then you can start beaming again. This is a huge DPS gain to only have to cast the flail 2 times instead of 3 between each beam. So this one is just overloaded with a lot of cool features, really a must-have skill. And then finally, for our non-ultimate abilities on the back bar, we have another flex spot here. So this will be our primary flex spot. And then if you need something else, a secondary flex spot, you can use that camo hunter slot we talked about earlier. And these could be a number of different skills. Could be an additional damage ability. In Rise 128k parse, you use Scalding Rune here. If you are using a two-handed back bar, Carve would be a really nice option to put in this spot. And then Poison Injection would be really good if you're using a bow on the back bar. Or you could go with a heal or a shield, or really whatever utility you need. In my 125k parts, I just stuck the Fighters Guild heal Ring of Preservation here and used it as a passive slot just for the weapon and spell damage boost. But if you need a heal, you are generally better off putting Vigor there. Both morphs of this are very good depending on your situation. The Arcanist heal Evolving Rune Mend, this one is pretty nice too because it generates a crux when you cast it. Then Rune of the Colorless Pool, this is a bit better suited for a support to run for group play, but for solo this could be a very nice DPS gain, adding in minor vulnerability and minor brittle to the target for 20 seconds. And then similarly with the Arcanist Domain, this is better suited to run on its support, but if you don't have an Arcanist support in your group, it may be worth it to have a DPS cast this every 20 seconds. Then Cruxweaver Armor is a really nice ability. Not only does it let you be a bit more defensive with your major resolve if that's not already provided, but this will also put minor breach on any enemies attacking you, letting you deal a bit more damage to them, and and it will auto-generate a crux for you when you take damage. This part does have a 5-second cooldown, but it could save you some more time between beams if you are auto-generating these crux. Caltrops is another great option here. Both morphs are very solid. The Razor morph is not as good for DPS as anti-cavalry since it only lasts 10 seconds rather than 15, but it is an AoE source of major breach, which is a very nice debuff if you don't have somebody providing that. And if you only need a single target source of major breach, elemental susceptibility is also a really nice skill, and it'll add in a lot of damage with the other status effects that it procs too. Really, the choice is yours for these flex spots. That's why they're called flex spots, whatever your situation might call for. And then finally, for our ultimate ability on the back bar, we're running the Unblinking Eye. Both morphs of this are really good. The Languid Eye morph does a tiny bit more damage, but it is cast on a location, so for stuff with a lot of movement, you'll probably be better off with the Tide King's Gaze morph. This one is cast on a target and will follow them around for 8 seconds. Both of them are AoE though, and both do very similar damage. The Languid morph is a bit more bursty since it comes in a 6-second window though, instead of the 8 seconds of Tide King. I think I'll probably use Tide King a little bit more, but definitely be swapping back and forth between these two depending on what I'm working on. You can also use the Fiery Rage Destro ult here. It is a good bit more expensive than the Unblinking Eye at 250 cost instead of 175, so the damage per ult spent is worse. However, if you already have enough ult built up, just as something to open up with, or maybe for a certain trash encounter, the Destro ult is a fair bit larger at 8 meters instead of 5 meters, and it also hits for a little bit more damage. But for most encounters, you'll just keep the Unblinking Eye here. So I already laid out how we build crux with the flail and spend it with the beam, but this system is also woven into our passives. We have Fated Fortune. This is 12% crit damage. It only lasts for 7 seconds and it triggers whenever you build or spend crux. So this does limit the class a bit with their variety of playstyles, but that's for a different discussion. If you are using the flail and the beam that we already went over, this is no problem to keep up. Implacable Outcome will generate ultimate whenever you use your beam, so pretty easy to make use of this passive as well. And then we have Hideous Clarity. This restores your highest resource whenever you build crux. So this will not only be an important sustain tool, but it will also help us keep up the Harnessed Quintessence passive. This is a 5% boost to weapon and spell damage that lasts for 10 seconds whenever you restore magicka or stamina. Now this doesn't work with passive recovery, but it does work with the Hideous Clarity passive. So again, as long as you are doing the crux building with the flail and crux spending with the beam, all of these passives will naturally take care of themselves. And then here are a few of the other essential ones to grab as a damage dealer, though it is worth mentioning that some of the others in the kit will be nice to pick up for defense and healing as well. All right, for our next skill setup, this is fairly similar to what we just ran through, so I won't go through each skill one by one again, but this is the one I'm calling the 1.5 bar build. So technically we are using 2 bars here, but the only 2 active skills on the back bar for damage are going to be Quick Cloak and Inspired Scholarship. So the nice thing about these is that they are 30 seconds each, so we end up not spending much time at all on the back bar, and it ends up feeling like something kind of in between the traditional 1 bar and 2 bar builds. The damage levels are not quite as high as setting up like the first setup, but I was still able to get over 118k DPS without using Coral Riptide, and even 115k DPS using no trial sets at all. So this is definitely a viable option that is a little bit easier to keep up. Front bar is pretty much the same, except we have our Quick Cloak already covered on the back bar, so I moved Fulminating Rune up to that front bar spot. And then that leaves us with 3 flex spots on the back bar, a lot of wiggle room to put in whatever you might end up needing. I just stacked Fighter's Guild abilities here for the dummy parse, but this could be any of those utility skills that we just covered in the previous section. And then finally for the 1 bar Oakensoul setup, this is the skill loadout that got me 100k DPS. So the essentials here are Inspired Scholarship, Cephaliarch's Flail, the Fate Carver Beam, and the Unblinking Eye ultimate. And same thing goes here that we talked about earlier. Both morphs of Fate Carver are really good. Exhausting is a tiny bit more damage, while Pragmatic gives you a little bit more survivability. And then both ultimate morphs are good as well. Then we have Deadly Cloak and Barbed Trap. These will be our flex spots if we end up needing something else in our our kit, maybe the heal on Cephaliarch's Flail is not enough to sustain your health, but if I can, I'm really going to try to run these two, especially for single target damage. The damage from Barbed Trap will trigger a ton of hemorrhaging damage, that is the bleed status effect, and Deadly Cloak will keep your enchantments proccing while you're beaming, which will add a ton of burning and poison damage from your flame and poison enchantments. Also, just a really nice AoE dot itself, and gives you major evasion to stack with your minor evasion class passive for a total of 30% reduced damage taken from AoEs. But there are a lot of skills that we listed earlier that could be really good here in these two spots, like Fulminating Rune also, for example, would be really great for AoE and adding damage for your teammates with the synergies. And yeah, like I said, all of those utility skills as well that we already covered. But you definitely want the Inspired Scholarship, Cephaliarch's Flail, Fate Carver, and Unblinking Eye. Those are kind of the key ones there. All right, for the final section of this video, I'll just run through some rotation tips. We'll talk about what skills to precast and generally how the rotation will look. Now, I definitely wouldn't call the Arcanist difficult. I think it is one of the easier classes to play for sure, but I think some will look at that long beam channel and assume it is a bit easier than it actually is. You do still need to be a bit careful with how things line up, as you don't want to start beaming right before all of your dots fall off. So for this section, let's start with the easiest one, and that is the 1-bar setup. I just precast my Inspired Scholarship, the Blade Cloak, and then I drop Barbed Trap and start my light attack weaving with Cephaliarch's Flail. And this will put that 5% damage taken debuff on the target. After that, I drop my ultimate. In this case, I'm using the Languid Eye Morph. And since I went into the encounter full on Crux, I can immediately start beaming here. Otherwise, I'd want to cast enough flails to hit 3 Crux, and then I would start beaming. Whenever that beam runs out, I'll already have 1 Crux built up from the Tome Bearer skill, so I just need to cast the flail twice, and then I can start beaming again. And that's pretty much how the rotation goes. After that next beam though, I cast my flail twice again, but instead of going into another beam, I notice my dots are running off. So I'm going to reapply those before I start the beam. So typically my rule of thumb is that if a dot is going to last at least halfway through the beam, I don't worry about reapplying it early. The beam just does so much damage. It's better to go ahead and just beam than recast skills early before their timers are up. So that's pretty much it for the 1-bar setup. Just keep rotating the 2 flail casts to build Crux, keep your 3 dots and ultimate going, and beam away when nothing else needs to be reapplied. For the 1.5 bar build, we have a very similar opening with Tome Bearer, Quick Cloak, and Barbed Trap, but this time there is some bar swapping involved, and we will light attack weave into Fulminating Rune, and then the flail, and then our ultimate, and then we start beaming. And from here, the principles are really the same as the 1-bar build. The rotation ends up very similar, except you just have those 2 back bar dots to also keep up every 30 seconds. So you still have the 2 20-second dots on the front bar, 2 30-second dots on the back bar. Really not much more difficult than the Oakensoul setup, and you have a bit higher ceiling with this one as well. So I think this one is a good one to move into if you like the 1-bar setups, but maybe you're trying to push things a little bit more and get more comfortable with 2 bars. And then finally, for the standard 2-bar setup, this one is using Coral Riptide. So if you're not using that set, you can ignore this first step, but we're just dumping our stamina low to start off the encounter. And then after that, it's the same opening again as the other 2. We start with our Inspired Scholarship, Blade Cloak, and Barbed Trap. And then we'll start our light attack weaving with our Blockade of Fire, then Fulminating Rune, Cephaliarch's Flail. Then we'll drop our ultimate, and then we start beaming. And then from there, it's the same principles again. Just keep your dots up, and you should only need to cast Flail twice in between each beam to get the full 3 Crux again. The version I used here is only slightly harder than the 1.5 bar setup, but with Whorl being 15 seconds, Fulminating Rune at 20 seconds, and Inspired Scholarship at 30 seconds, you are doing a bit more bar swapping with this setup than you would in the 1.5 bar build. And then for the advanced version, Rye also filled in that back bar flex spot with Scalding Rune to add in another dot. It does seem like, at least for single target stuff like the dummy, you can squeak out a tiny bit more this way, but I'd say this is definitely not necessary for most content. For his opening burst, he said he actually did a little better not casting all of his dots initially so that he could get the beam and the ultimate boosted in that initial off balance window from our Exploiter champion point passive, and he was also trying to use the ultimate whenever off balance was active as well. So really lining everything up, all that big burst into those off balance windows. Like I said, it is a little bit more advanced, a little bit more to keep up with, but at 128k DPS, well, the results speak for themselves. I don't know about you guys, but I cannot wait to level up and play my Arcanist. I think the playstyle is really unique and fun, and hopefully this video helps you get the most out of yours. As I always say, please treat this as a base to work from. Always adjust as needed for your specific situation. Thank you so much for watching, and a big thanks to my Patreon and YouTube members. Your support helps a ton to keep the website and YouTube channel going. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougars Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Iffy, Blake1816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Vidridi, Florian, Phoenix, Nalandia, Unemployed, Chryseliana, Cha-Cha, Technical KO, and Cap. I'll close this one out with a few clips of the setups in action on the trial dummy. Thanks again, and see you later. Bye.
repeat this information, press payment $2.80. This completes your payment transaction. To refresh, $2.80. This completes your payment transaction.